Hey y'all, here are OS Reviews. Today we're taking a throwback look at the Umidigi 1 here in 2023. This is a relatively budget Android smartphone that came out in 2018, so it's approaching 5 years old. Time really does fly. Although we've done plenty of revisited reviews on flagship phones through the years, including iPhones and Samsung Galaxy S devices, we have very rarely seen how a budget or mid-range phone has held up over a longer period of time. So I thought that this would be a good candidate to just check out. It's also because when we started reviewing Umidigi phones, it was actually closer to 2020. So this was a phone that was really in the early days of this brand before we actually started to take a look at their products. So I thought it would be interesting to see more of their origins as well. Picking up this phone, immediately I'm nostalgic for the days when smartphones were much more compact. This is a 5.9-inch panel phone, but it fits very comfortably into one hand because of that taller aspect ratio. Here it is next to the much more current Umidigi A13 Pro Max that we recently did a review on, and you can tell that difference is pretty significant. It's very similar, in fact, to the iPhone X, which undoubtedly Umidigi took inspiration from around that time. You can even see the vertical camera position there, as well as the use of a shiny aluminum rail, which glistens when catching the light. Definitely shows a bit more of attention to detail on those small edges, although the gradient finish on the back is definitely eye-catching and perhaps also derived from something like the Huawei P20, which was also popular at the time, including real glass on both the front and the back, and there is a Pro version of this phone which even supports Qi wireless charging as well as having stereo speaker support, which are just really rare to find on a device that is in the budget price range. This contrasts with newer Umidigi phones that have since transitioned into either using a powdered matte aluminum texture or on their newer devices entirely polycarbonate plastic. So the back here is plastic, the side rails are plastic as well, and this has become more of the industry norm. It certainly has its upsides. For instance, it's pretty durable as a material, but I have to admit that metal and glass just feels a little bit more premium, not to mention this crazy gradient finish that was all the rage back in 2018-2019, although they also made a more conservative carbon fiber textured version as well. Similarities also extended onto the front, where we have that notch on the top there, although it doesn't have real secure face unlock, but also has the front-facing camera. The rear cameras on this thing, by the way, are 12 megapixel for the primary, and then a 5 megapixel depth sensor powered by the octa-core MediaTek Helio P23 processor, which was a mid-tier chip at the time. In 2023 standards, though, it is very much into the budget territory and even verging on pretty slow, but we'll see that more later on this video, but still usable for very basic tasks at least, and it is also coupled with 4 gigabytes of built-in RAM, and we have a 3,550 milliamp hour capacity battery inside as well, which on the regular one charges up at 10 watts versus 18 watts on the Pro edition of the phone. That is a little bit faster as well, plus support for that Qi wireless charging. Now it does also support face unlock, but it's again not quite as secure as the fingerprint scanner, but further drawing similarities to the iPhone X when you're putting them side by side, as well as the Huawei P20 as well. Really, it looks like they took some heavy inspiration there, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing for a phone maker that was really just starting out. On the right-hand edge, you have access to the power key, which also serves double duty as the fingerprint scanner. Not the fastest in the world, but still is quite reliable and at least accurate. There's also access to a volume rocker, and then down below here, we have the speaker, 3.5mm headphone jack, USB Type-C port for charging, and then the other edge housed the microSD/SIM card tray, and that was more or less it. Of course, with such a beautiful finish, it is a bit of a fingerprint magnet, but still looks quite eye-catching from a design perspective. Now here on the front there is a noticeable chin, which of course for an LCD panel it's not able to really curve in the way that OLED screens can, such as on the iPhone X, to achieve an even smaller bottom bezel, but this thing is for sure much more noticeable in 2023 standards. But on a more compact phone it's still manageable again with one hand. This is a fully laminated IPS LCD screen, so viewing angles, even brightness output I think are all pretty satisfactory. It doesn't look shabby at all on a slightly smaller size. Granted, it is a HD plus resolution or 720p as opposed to 1080 that we might expect, but again, it's actually kind of hard to tell, and they have used a relatively at least well calibrated in terms of color panel on here for what it is. Taking a closer look at the software experience, this phone runs on Android 8.1 Oreo, and that is one thing that is a little unfortunate about some of these kind of less well-known manufacturers is the OS level updates are much more scarce, and this point I think is illustrated here since it never really received an upgrade past that to say Android 9 or 10. To Umidigi's credit though, they did push lots of over-the-air security patches and some slight UI revisions, even though the base OS was never upgraded. For example, Umidigi added support for gestures that was actually missing on Android Oreo. It was only introduced by Android Pie, but Umidigi added their own implementation before then onto Oreo themselves, just to go for a more full-screen experience, again, rivaling that of what maybe Apple has. The gesture navigational method, though, is a little bit different compared to stock Android. We can actually swipe up from the middle there to go home, and also swipe up and hold to open up multitasking, and then swiping up from either the left or the right corners will take you back by one page. Something that hasn't changed even on their current phones would be how clean the software experience is, which is a pleasant surprise. There are no bloatware or too much extra apps that you don't need pre-included out of the box. Just the standard ones from Google, including the Play Store, as well as an FM radio that takes advantage of the headphone jack as the antenna and a file manager, and that is pretty much it. So you can then take up the space with apps that you actually need instead of having to uninstall ones that come pre-included. Quick look at the camera, you can see how it's just a very basic experience, but at the very least there is support for HDR. Now, at the time of its release, Umidigi received some flack for unfortunately not really using the secondary 5-megapixel camera at all, and the bokeh mode wasn't even present in the software. But through another update, they actually brought that over, and now that secondary lens is actually detecting depth and will blur out the background. Granted, it's not the best effect in the world. Overall camera optimization, computational photography really isn't a strength on smaller phone brands like this, which are more limited on resources. Under advanced settings, we have the ability to go into stereo, or aka bokeh, as well as capturing panorama. It's a little bit slow by 2023 standards, but again, gives you some of the adjustments that you can play around with. And if we take a quick look at some of the results, here is one such example taken using bokeh. You can tell the edge might seem a little bit over sharpened, but it has detected it properly. It's not just doing a circle and then kind of a fake effect of blurring the background, but it actually knows where the edges are, and then everything that is further away is indeed a little bit fuzzier. Albeit maybe still a little bit on the artificial looking side, but the intensity, again, you're able to adjust using the app. As far as other shots are concerned, if you hold still, the 12-megapixel sensor is capable of actually capturing some decent looking results, which are sharp enough, I'd say, in well-lit outdoor environments or if there's plenty of light indoors. However, it doesn't have optical image stabilization, and it takes a noticeable kind of second to two to fully capture and process an image, so it can be a little on the sluggish side. And when the lights start turning down, well, it doesn't really have a night mode to speak of at all, so you're going to struggle a lot more in low light situations. But again, for a camera of its age on a budget device, I would say, again, a little bit better than I was expecting, to be completely honest, despite not being quite as good as, of course, latest gen flagships, but still, again, colors in well-lit conditions can still look reasonable. A closer peek into settings, this is where you're able to add additional biometrics, including Face ID, and under navigation features, this is where you can take a look at changing gestures versus having the physical navigation bar at the bottom, which, by the way, you can also reverse the keys if desired. And for the swipe up gestures, you can also choose a slightly different layout, such as instead of multitasking, long holding to pull up the voice assistant from Google. And there is a small visual indicator at the bottom as well that just subtly hints at the regions which you can swipe on to correlate to the different gestures. Everything else is very much faithful to stock Android, including the newsfeed here on the left, as well as, again, all the regular Android apps you get out of the box. The drop-down notification shade is also fairly stock, although what's kind of surprising is all the icons here are fully interactive. Even the small ones, like the settings bar, you can tap on here to bring you there, as well as even the date. If you tap on, it will take you into the alarm clock app. So that's something that has since, of course, changed on stock Android, but it can make some of these icons a little harder to completely hit unless you fully expand on that view. So some takeaways being that overall video consumption is still perfectly feasible on this device. Antenna and reception quality for dual band Wi-Fi and 4G LTE also both seem to be adequate. With that being said, you can definitely tell how system animations can stutter when you're doing things too quickly, especially when the phone first starts up. So the MediaTek P23, although it's a 2 GHz octa-core processor, kind of similar to, say, a Snapdragon 400 to 600 series chip, is no longer going to be the best performer in the world anymore, although watching back videos certainly still feels smooth enough. Again, the screen here I am kind of impressed by, just because despite being just an HD plus res, it just seems sharper and better than the spec there implies, just because there is no bleeding of any kind, and again, contrast even seems to be quite good for what it is. There is support for picture-in-picture mode, even on Android Oreo, by the way, so you can do some split-screen multitasking, and 4 GB of RAM is not too shabby, I suppose, in that department, so you can still open up 2 or 3 apps at once without too many issues there. It's really just that GPU and CPU that is not the kind of fastest in the world, and as a result, we see a little bit more of judderiness around the UI, but perfectly still usable. Now, similarly, the built-in speakers do get relatively loud. The regular version doesn't have the stereo separation that the Pro delivers, but overall, not too problematic. Plus, you can have headphones that you can plug in yourself to further improve on that experience. Similarly, if we jump into the browser, you can see it uses the stock Gboard as well. That also offers haptic vibrations when you're typing. And despite being a slightly smaller screen, overall, it's still a pretty comfortable layout for just searching things up and texting purposes. Loading up web pages also seems to be decent. You can tell how it's just going to be maybe a split second slower than on newer phones, but it's still perfectly serviceable as long as you have a touch more patience with it. Again, not lightning fast by any means, especially if you're loading up the full desktop version of the site, but once everything loads, it still feels decent, and this is a pretty complex page. Lots of videos and ads, and it's still able to perform all right, I would say. Surprising in some sense that it is holding up and loading back these demanding pages even today. Now, in terms of overall system performance, I will also say that thermals tends to be a little bit warmer than I was expecting. I think this is really before MediaTek really turned around their reputation in the recent years and are now becoming much more of a close competitor with Qualcomm in terms of both graphics as well as efficiency. This, though, was still in the stage of them trying to improve on. So what that means is if you are doing a lot of video consumption and gaming, the phone does get significantly warm along the bottom left-hand edges. And similarly, when you're charging the phone using a fast charger, it gets actually quite toasty. As we're doing a little bit of gaming, I would really recommend keeping things light to titles like Stack, Angry Bird, Subway Surfers, Crossy Road, titles like that will still run alright, but anything more graphically demanding like PUBG or Asphalt, you're just not going to get a very good experience because this is a pretty aging chip that was never super powerful to begin with. But for casual gaming titles, you can still tell that it still seems reasonable enough. So that is more or less it as far as a revisited look back at the Umidigi 1/1 Pro, and it's nostalgic in many ways like we touched on. From the build quality perspective, I think it shows that Umidigi were a little bit more ambitious in those early days, kind of sparing no cost from a construction perspective and just really making the phone feel a lot more premium. I will also point out that in terms of system performance and specs, this phone is pretty much par and par the same with the Umidigi Z2 and Z2 Pro that came out later on, also rocking that Helio P23 processor. Although the one here is special because of its more compact size, which is something that unfortunately the industry has seemingly left behind. But I know I'm not alone in wishing that more manufacturers would start to provide more compact phones again with more powerful flagship grade performance. As for this particular device, it kind of shows that in some ways it's surprising that it still has held up as well as it did, but anything that is more demanding is going to be an area where on a kind of older mid-ranger, if not budget phone, it's going to struggle more as apps as well as the UI in general becomes more graphically demanding over time. Still a beautiful design nonetheless that even looks striking today here in 2023. Thanks for watching this revisited look back here at OS Reviews. That's been the Umidigi 1.